Welcome. Tonight, we're taking a slow walk through the history of Panem, from the world that came before it, to the rise of the capital, to the wars, the games, and the fall of the nation that once seemed impossible to break. This is a calm retelling of that history from beginning to end. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the story unfold, one chapter at a time. For my Syra. Panem began after the collapse of North America. Long before the capital ruled the country, the continent had already been damaged by environmental disaster and war. Droughts, fires, storms, and rising seas changed the land itself. Coastlines were lost. Resources became harder to protect. Entire regions grew less stable, less connected, and harder to support than they had been before. That older world did not disappear in one sudden break. It weakened over time. Cities that once depended on long supply lines became harder to maintain. Roads and trade routes that had once linked distant places stopped working as reliably as they once had. Food became less certain. Fuel became less certain. Travel became more dangerous. The farther something had to move, the harder it became to trust that it would arrive at all. As those systems broke down, daily life narrowed. People depended more on whatever could still be reached close to home. Usable land, clean water, shelter, fuel, and the communities around them. In a world like that, survival changes the value of things. A place that can still grow food matters more. A place that can still defend itself matters more. A place that can still organize people and resources matters more than old names, old borders, or older ideas of how the continent used to work. That shift is important because it explains why the nation that came later was built the way it was. A society formed in a time of stability can afford openness. A society formed after collapse is more likely to value order, control, and central power. Once people have lived through years of shortage, violence, and uncertainty, safety begins to matter more than freedom. The promise of structure becomes more persuasive. A strong center begins to look less like a threat and more like a solution. That was the world Panem rose from. North America had once been a continent of older governments, older cities, and wider systems. By the time Panem began to take shape, much of that older order had already failed. What remained was a harsher landscape, with fewer certainties and fewer choices. The land still held people, resources, and surviving settlements, but it no longer supported life in the same way it once had. What had survived now had to be gathered, controlled, and defended. That is the real beginning of Panem's history. Not the capital yet, not the districts yet, not the later rituals, punishments, and wars that would define the nation for generations. First came the collapse of the older world. Then came the conditions that made a new one possible. By the time the first foundations of Panem were being laid, the people living on this continent had already learned hard lessons. They knew what happened when systems stretched too far. They knew what scarcity did to law, trade, and trust. They knew that order could be built out of fear as easily as out of hope. Panem did not rise from abundance. It rose from damage. It did not rise because the old world was replaced by something better. It rose because the old world had become too unstable to hold, and a new power was able to gather what remained into something stricter, smaller, and easier to control. Everything that comes later begins there, in a broken North America, on a continent already shaped by loss, where survival came first, and where the first pieces of a new nation were assembled out of whatever the old one had left behind. Out of the ruins of North America, a new nation was formed. It was called Panem. At its center stood the capital. Around it were 13 districts. That much is clear. By the time Panem enters recorded history, the old continent is gone as a political world, and this new one is already in place. The capital is the center of power. The districts surround it. Each district is tied to labor and production. That is the shape of the nation from the beginning. The country is not organized as a collection of equal regions. It is organized from the center outward. The capital rules. The districts provide. That arrangement matters because it means inequality was built into Panem from the start. Political power did not sit evenly across the country. It sat in one place. The labor that kept the nation alive was spread across the outer regions instead. The districts were not interchangeable. Each one had a function. Each one was expected to produce something the nation needed: food, fuel, transportation, technology, luxury goods, lumber, livestock, textiles, power. The exact district roles become clearer later, but the basic structure is already there. The capital at the top, and the districts arranged around specialized production. That is what made Panem more than a surviving settlement. It was a system. Not just a city with outlying towns, but a nation built around controlled labor, controlled resources, and controlled distance. The capital did not simply exist beside the districts. It depended on them. And the districts did not simply belong to the country. They were bound to it. What they produced moved inward. What ruled them remained at the center. That is the form Panem took as it hardened into a nation. A central city, 13 districts, a divided country held together by production, dependence, and unequal power. By the time Panem was fully formed, the basic logic of the country was already in place. Once Panem had been established, the country entered a period of controlled order. The capital ruled. The districts worked. That part had already been decided. What came next was the slow settling of that system into everyday life. Panem was no longer just a new nation on paper. It had become a way of living. The capital governed from the center. The districts carried out the labor that kept the country functioning. Over time, that arrangement stopped feeling temporary. It became normal. Children were born into it. Families built their lives inside it. Work, trade, authority, and punishment all began to move according to the same national pattern. That is what made early Panem stable on the surface. The country had a structure. It had a center of power. It had a clear division of labor. And for a time, that was enough to hold it together. But stability is not the same as fairness. The order that held Panem together did not benefit all parts of the country equally. The capital had political control. It also had the greatest comfort, security, and access to what the districts produced. The districts did the work that fed the nation, powered it, built it, and supplied it. But they did not share equally in the power of the system they sustained. That imbalance did not need to be explained to the people living under it. It would have been visible in ordinary life. In one place, authority would feel close. In another, it would feel distant. In one place, decisions would be made. In another, they would simply be obeyed. That difference matters, because it is how political power becomes part of daily experience. It stops being abstract. It becomes something people live inside. If you were born in the capital, the nation would likely feel orderly and secure. If you were born in a district, the nation would feel more demanding. Its expectations would be closer than its protection. Its rules would be more visible than its rewards. That is how the divide in Panem deepened, not only through law, but through habit, through repetition, through people growing up under the same arrangement long enough that it began to seem fixed. The districts were expected to keep producing. The capital was expected to remain in charge. That was the logic of the country. And because it lasted, it began to shape how people understood their place in the world. In the capital, power would appear natural. In the districts, burden would begin to feel inherited. That is one of the most important developments in early Panem. The system did not have to remake itself each year. It only had to continue. The longer it continued, the deeper it reached into ordinary life. Work would already be tied to place. Opportunity would already be uneven. The distance between command and labor would already be built into the map of the country. That is the kind of arrangement that can last for years. It can look strong. It can look settled. But if its inequalities remain in place long enough, they do not disappear. They harden. The people living in the districts would not have needed a speech to tell them they were carrying more than the capital was. They would have seen it in what was expected of them. They would have seen it in what moved out of their regions and what remained behind. They would have understood that Panem functioned because the outer parts of the nation kept functioning. That understanding is important because it helps explain what came next. The dark days did not rise out of nowhere. They did not appear because the country was peaceful and then suddenly broke. They grew out of a system that had already been unequal for years. A system that worked well enough to survive, but not well enough to remove the resentment building underneath it. That is what Panem became in the years before the rebellion. A functioning nation. A controlled nation. A country that looked stable from the top while pressure gathered below. The capital remained in power. The districts remained in place. The system continued doing what it had been built to do. And as it continued, the divide inside it became sharper, clearer, and harder to live with. That was the condition of Panem before the dark days began. Not chaos, not open war. A nation already holding together under strain, with the next great conflict still ahead, but already taking shape beneath the surface. The first great war in Panem became known as the Dark Days. It was the point when the country broke into open conflict. By then, Panem had already existed long enough for resentment to deepen and for the divide inside the nation to become impossible to hold together quietly. What followed was not a scattered protest. It was a rebellion. The districts rose against the capital, and the capital responded with war. The full military history of the Dark Days is never laid out battle by battle. There is no complete record of every campaign, every commander, or every district's exact role in the fighting. But the larger shape of the conflict is clear. This was the first great attempt to overthrow the capital, and it failed. The capital won the war. That victory became one of the defining facts of Panem's history. Everything that followed was built on it. The country that came after the Dark Days was not simply Panem restored. It was Panem transformed by defeat, fear, and punishment. District 13 became the clearest symbol of that transformation. After the war, The official story across Panem was that District 13 had been destroyed. From that point on, the nation was publicly presented as the capital and 12 districts, not 13. That change mattered for more than the map. It changed the memory of the country. The loss of District 13 became a warning built into Panem itself. The rebellion was no longer just something that had happened in the past. It became part of the nation's official story about what happens when the capital is challenged. That is why the Dark Days matter so much. They did not only end in military defeat, they created a new political reality. Before the war, Panem had already been unequal. After the war, the capital ruled with the memory of rebellion behind every major decision. The war gave the capital something it would use for the rest of its history. Proof that rebellion had happened once. Proof that the capital had survived it. And a reason to make punishment central to the nation that followed. That is the true aftermath of the Dark Days. The capital did not answer the rebellion with reform. It did not share power. It did not rebuild the country on fairer terms. Instead, it used victory to make its authority harder, harsher, and more visible. The nation that emerged from the Dark Days was more tightly controlled than the one that had gone into them. Fear was no longer just part of life in Panem. It became part of how the country was governed. The capital wanted the districts to remember defeat. It wanted the war to remain alive in public memory. It wanted the nation to live in the shadow of that lesson. That is the environment in which the next major institution of Panem was created. The war ended, but the capital did not let the country move past it. Instead, it built the memory of the Dark Days into the structure of national life. That is why the conflict stands as a turning point in Panem's history. It marks the end of one stage of the nation and the beginning of another. After the Dark Days, the capital was no longer simply the ruling center of the country. It became the victor of a civil war, ruling over a population that had once tried to overthrow it. That changed everything. It changed the way the capital saw the districts. It changed the way the districts were expected to live. It changed what the country was allowed to remember and what it was forced to remember. From then on, Panem would be ruled not only by central power, but by the memory of crushed rebellion. And from that memory came the next great development in the country's history, a yearly punishment designed to make the end of the Dark Days impossible to forget. After the Dark Days, the capital did not simply declare victory and move on. It rewrote the country. The rebellion had failed. District 13 was said to be gone. The remaining districts were forced back under capital rule. Then came the Treaty of Treason. That treaty became the official settlement that followed the war. It did not offer reconciliation. It offered terms. It set down the new laws that would govern the defeated districts. And among those laws was the creation of the Hunger Games. The purpose of the games was stated plainly. They were a yearly reminder that the Dark Days must never be repeated. Each year, every district would send tributes. Those children would be taken from their homes, placed in an arena, and forced into a spectacle of punishment that the whole nation was meant to witness. That mattered because the capital was not only punishing the districts for rebellion, it was making memory into policy. The war was over. The reminder would not be. The capital took one past conflict and turned it into a ritual that would return every year. That is what made the Hunger Games more than cruelty alone. They were also political design. The capital wanted the districts to remember defeat. It wanted children to grow up inside that memory. It wanted parents to fear the state not only in theory, but in the most personal way possible. And it wanted the whole nation to stop and watch. The reaping became part of that design. The names were not chosen in private. They were called in public. Each district had to gather. Each district had to stand in the square. Each district had to hear the names read aloud. That turned punishment into ceremony. It made fear visible. It made grief official. And it tied the authority of the capital to a yearly event that no one in the districts could escape. The capital did not need to explain the message every time. The structure itself explained it. The districts had once risen. Now their children would be made to pay for it. That was the logic written into the games from the beginning. The games also changed the shape of time in Panem. From that point on, the year no longer moved only through seasons, harvests, work, and weather. It also moved toward reaping day. The capital had taken the memory of rebellion and built it into the calendar. That is one of the reasons the games became so powerful. They were not rare. They were regular. They returned on schedule. And because they returned on schedule, they became part of daily life, even when they were not happening. The fear stayed there in advance. The dread arrived before the event itself. The capital understood what repetition could do. A punishment that happens once can be remembered. A punishment that happens every year can shape an entire society. Children grow up with it. Families plan around it. Districts learn to live beneath it. That was the country the Treaty of Treason created. A country where the capital's victory was not only recorded in history, it was reenacted, again and again. The earliest Hunger Games were not yet the polished spectacle they would become later. They were harsher, cruder, less controlled as entertainment. But the core idea was already complete. The districts would give up their children. The capital would stage the punishment. The country would be forced to watch. That was the beginning of the games. Not as tradition, not as sport, as the capital's answer to rebellion, a yearly instrument of fear, memory, and control. And once that system was in place, Panem entered a new stage of its history. The war was over. The punishment had begun. And the capital now had a ritual that could keep the dark days alive for every generation that followed. The 10th Hunger Games took place decades before Katniss Everdeen was born, at a point when the games were still young, still crude, and still far less polished than they would later become. They already existed as punishment, but they had not yet become the fully controlled national spectacle the capital would eventually turn them into. That is the world in which Coriolanus Snow first enters Panem's history. At this point, Snow is 18 years old. He is not yet the president of Panem. He is a student at the academy in the capital. His family still carries one of the oldest names in the city, but the war has stripped much of their wealth away. The Snow name still matters. Their old security does not. That difference is important. Coriolanus grows up with status, ambition, and fear of losing both. He wants power. He wants stability. He wants the future his family once expected to have. And he believes success in the 10th Hunger Games may help him get it. That year, the capital introduces a new idea. Students from the academy are assigned as mentors to the tributes. The change matters because it marks one of the first major attempts to reshape the games. Until then, the event has largely been punishment made public. Now, the capital is beginning to experiment. It is beginning to ask whether the games can be made more engaging, more watchable, and more useful. Snow is assigned the female tribute from District 12. Her name is Lucy Gray Baird. She is not a miner's daughter in the usual sense. She belongs to the Covey, a traveling musical group that had been trapped in District 12 after the war. From the beginning, Lucy Gray stands out. At the reaping, she sings. She holds the crowd's attention. She refuses to disappear into the role the capital expects from a district tribute. That immediately makes her different from many of the others. It also makes Snow notice her as more than a problem. He sees possibility. District 12 is poor. Its tributes are not expected to win. But Lucy Gray has something most tributes do not: presence. That matters to Snow. He understands quickly that attention has value. If the capital is beginning to care about presentation, then a tribute who could command a crowd might survive longer than one who cannot. Around Snow, other important figures are already shaping the future of Panem. One of them is Dr. Volumnia Gaul. She is the game maker overseeing the Hunger Games, and she represents one of the darkest philosophies in the series. Gaul believes in chaos as the natural state of humanity. She believes control must be imposed by force. To her, the games are not only punishment, they are proof. They are a way of demonstrating what people become when order falls away. Her influence matters because she sees in Snow someone who might carry that worldview forward. Another key figure is Sir Janus Plinth. He is Snow's classmate. His family came from District 2 and became wealthy by supporting the capital during the war. Now they live in the capital, but Sir Janus does not think like most capital students. He is disturbed by the games. He feels sympathy for the tributes. He has not accepted the capital's cruelty as normal. That makes him important in a different way. Where Gaul pushes Snow toward power, Sir Janus stands as a moral contrast to him. The 10th Hunger Games unfold in a capital that still shows the scars of the dark days. The city is not yet the polished, indulgent place it will become later. There is still damage, still austerity, still a sense that the war has not fully faded into the past. The games themselves reflect that roughness. The tributes are kept in poor conditions. The arena is not impressive. The whole event feels unstable, as though the capital is still figuring out what this annual punishment is meant to be. That instability becomes literal when bombs explode during a visit to the arena. Tributes and mentors are killed. Chaos breaks out. The event is thrown into disorder before it has even properly begun. This matters because the 10th Games still feel close to the war that created them. They are not yet cleanly packaged. They still carry the rawness of their origin. At the same time, the capital is already trying to change that. Mentors are part of that effort. Interviews begin to matter more. Public perception begins to matter more. Sponsor gifts begin to matter more. The capital is learning that punishment can be shaped. It can be framed. It can be turned into something people follow more actively. Snow becomes part of that shift. He tries to make Lucy Gray visible. He advises her. He studies what draws attention. He begins to understand that image can change outcomes. That lesson stays with him for the rest of his life. The games themselves are brutal and chaotic. Lucy Gray survives not only because she is clever, but because Snow intervenes repeatedly. He bends rules. He hides his actions. He helps her in ways that are not allowed. At one point, he uses a handkerchief carrying her scent to influence Dr. Gall's engineered snakes, helping protect her when those snakes are released into the arena. Lucy Gray ultimately wins the 10th Hunger Games. That victory matters on several levels. For Lucy Gray, it means survival. For Snow, it means advancement, or at least the chance of it. But more importantly, it reveals who he is becoming. He does not treat the games as sacred rules to be respected. He treats them as a system to be manipulated if it serves his future. That is one of the clearest early signs of the man he will become. He is ambitious, he is calculating, and he is willing to justify cruelty if it protects status and control. The 10th Hunger Games are therefore important for two reasons. They are an early turning point in the evolution of the games themselves, and they are a turning point in the life of Coriolanus Snow. The Capitol is beginning to discover how spectacle can strengthen punishment. Snow is beginning to discover how performance, fear, and public attention can be used as tools. The games are still young, still rough, still close to their origin in war, but the future is already taking shape. Lucy Gray Baird survives the arena, Snow survives the moment, and Panem moves one step closer to the version of itself that will later seem so fixed. A country where violence is staged, where power is performed, and where Coriolanus Snow will eventually stand at the center of both. The 10th Hunger Games did not end when Lucy Gray Baird won. For Coriolanus Snow, that victory was only the beginning of a much more important turning point. He had helped Lucy Gray survive. He had broken rules to do it, and those choices caught up with him. Instead of stepping neatly into the future he wanted, Snow was sent away from the capital and assigned as a peacekeeper in District 12. That matters because District 12 became the place where the last illusions of his youth finally fell away. Up to that point, Snow had been ambitious, controlled, and willing to bend morality when it helped him. In District 12, those qualities hardened into something colder. He was reunited with Lucy Gray there. For a time, the two of them moved back into each other's orbit, but the relationship was no longer simple. The arena had changed them both. So had the capital. So had Snow's growing need to protect himself at any cost. District 12 also brought Sejanus Plinth back into Snow's life. Sejanus had been his classmate at the academy, the son of a wealthy family from District 2, and one of the few capital students who never accepted the games as normal. He had sympathy for the tributes. He had conscience. And in District 12, that conscience pushed him into real danger. Sejanus became involved with people who were thinking about resistance. He could not ignore injustice quietly. Snow could. That is the difference between them, and it becomes decisive here. Snow chose self-preservation. When Sejanus confided in him, Snow passed information along. The result was fatal. Sejanus was arrested and executed. That moment matters enormously in Snow's history. It is one of the clearest points where he chooses survival and advancement over loyalty, friendship, or moral restraint. After that, whatever uncertainty remained in him begins to disappear. Lucy Gray becomes part of that final collapse too. Snow's feelings for her had always been tangled up with fear, ambition, and control. By the time they try to leave District 12 together, he no longer sees her simply as someone he cares for. He also sees risk. He sees what she knows. He sees what she represents. And when suspicion takes hold, trust breaks. Snow turns on her. Lucy Gray disappears into the woods, and her fate is never fully confirmed. That uncertainty matters. She leaves the story as one of its great unresolved absences. Snow does not. He survives the moment and returns to the capital. By the time he gets back, he is no longer just a gifted student who has passed through a violent institution. He is becoming the kind of man Panem will one day know too well. He has now learned several lessons that define the rest of his life. He has learned that image matters. He has learned that fear can be managed. He has learned that systems can be manipulated from within. And most importantly, he has learned that he is willing to sacrifice other people in order to secure his own future. That is the real turning point. Snow's rise does not happen in one instant after this. The books do not lay out every office he holds or every promotion step by step, but the direction is unmistakable. He returns to the capital. He moves back toward power, and over time, he becomes one of the men shaping the country, rather than merely living under it. As Snow rises, the Hunger Games change with him. The earliest games had been crude. Their origin as punishment was obvious. Their violence was direct. Their presentation was rough. But the capital begins to refine them. Mentors matter more. Interviews matter more. Sponsors matter more. Tributes are packaged more carefully. The arena becomes more elaborate. The audience is given more reason to follow the event not only with fear, but with fascination. That is one of the most important developments in Panem's history. The purpose of the games does not change. They are still punishment. They are still a yearly reminder of defeat. They are still meant to keep the districts under control. But the form changes. The capital learns that punishment becomes stronger when it is turned into spectacle. It is not enough to make the districts suffer. The event must also hold attention. It must become part of the culture of the capital itself. It must feel annual, inevitable, and complete. Snow understands that world perfectly. He had already seen, during the 10th Games, how attention could shape survival. Now Panem begins moving toward the version of the games that later generations will know. More polished, more theatrical, more carefully staged, and therefore in some ways more dangerous. Because once violence is wrapped in ceremony, many people stop seeing it clearly. That is the country Snow helps shape as the years go on. The capital grows more confident, the games grow more sophisticated, and Panem hardens into the form it will keep for decades. By the time later victors enter the arena, the rawness of the early games is fading. In its place is a system that looks more stable, more glamorous, and more total. Snow is rising with that system, and the nation is becoming the version of Panem that will one day produce Haymitch Abernathy, Katniss Everdeen, and the rebellion that finally threatens everything Snow has built. The 50th Hunger Games were the second quarter Quell. That alone made them different from the games that came before. Every 25 years, the capital added a special condition to remind the districts that the original punishment could always be made worse. For the 50th Games, the rule was simple and brutal. Each district would send twice as many tributes. Instead of 24 children, there would be 48. The message was clear. The capital did not only control the games, it could reshape them whenever it wanted. That year, one of the boys chosen from District 12 was Haymitch Abernathy. He was 16 years old. He came from the seam. He was smart. sharp, and far more observant than many people around him realized. Later, Panem would know him as the only living victor from District 12, the mentor who drinks too much, the man who seems half broken long before Katniss Everdeen ever steps onto a stage. The 50th Hunger Games explain why. Before he became that man, Haymitch was simply another boy taken by the capital. District 12 lost 4 children that year, instead of 2. That matters. A district as small and poor as 12 would have felt the Quell more sharply than most. Twice the number of tributes meant twice the grief, twice the fear, and twice the proof that the capital could always raise the cost. Haymitch was not the only tribute from his district. Maisily Donna was there too. She matters not only because she survives deep into the arena, but because she becomes one of the few real human connections in Haymitch's story. Their alliance gives the games weight beyond strategy. It reminds you that even inside an arena, children still try to trust each other, help each other, and hold on to something human inside a system built to strip that away. The arena itself was designed in the capital's usual way, beautiful on the surface, deadly underneath. It was vast, carefully controlled, and full of hidden dangers. What looked natural had often been engineered. What seemed harmless could kill. That mattered because Haymitch won not through brute force, but through attention. He noticed things. He watched the arena closely. He understood that surviving in the games meant learning how the capital had designed the world around him. That made him dangerous in a way the capital never liked. He was not the strongest tribute. He was not the most glamorous. He was clever enough to see the machinery. As the field narrowed, Maisily and Haymitch stayed allied for a time. Eventually, they were separated. Maisily died in the arena, and Haymitch was left alone near the end. By then, he had discovered one of the arena's most important secrets. The force field at the edge could throw back anything that struck it. That realization became the key to his survival. In the final confrontation, Haymitch used the capital's own design against the last tribute. He let the force field do the work. That is why his victory matters so much. He did not just survive. He exposed the arena. He made the capital's control visible. He beat the games by understanding the trap better than the people who built it expected him to. The capital hated that. Haymitch was declared victor. It could not undo that. But it could punish him afterward. And it did. His family was killed. His girlfriend was killed. The lesson was unmistakable. A victor could live. A victor could even win in public. But if that victory embarrassed the capital, then the punishment would simply move somewhere else. That is what broke Haymitch long before Katniss ever knew him. He left the arena alive, but almost everything waiting for him outside, it was taken away. That is the legacy of the 50th Hunger Games. A quarter Quell designed to be harsher than anything before it. A victor from District 12 who won through intelligence rather than obedience. And a reminder that in Panem, survival did not mean safety. Sometimes it only meant living long enough to understand what the capital would still take from you. By the time Katniss Everdeen was born, District 12 had already spent decades at the edge of Panem. It was small, poor, remote. Its assigned industry was coal, and almost everything about the district reflected that fact. The town was worn down. The work was dangerous. The money was never enough. District 12 was divided inside itself as well. The seam was poorer, rougher, and more closely tied to mining families. The merchant section was slightly better off. That difference mattered. Even inside one of the weakest districts, inequality still existed. Some families had more food, some had more security, some had better homes. But none of that changed the larger truth. District 12 remained one of the poorest places in Panem. The mines shaped the district in every sense. They shaped the work. They shaped the schedule of life. They shaped the fears people carried. A mine explosion was never just an accident in District 12. It was the kind of event that could destroy a family overnight. That is exactly what happened to Katniss Everdeen. When she was 11 years old, her father died in a mine explosion. His death changed the course of her life. Her mother fell into deep depression. The household stopped functioning, and Katniss, still a child herself, became the person keeping the family alive. That is one of the most important facts about Katniss before the games. She was not shaped first by heroism. She was shaped by survival. District 12 forced that on her early. She learned to hunt beyond the fence. She learned to trade in the hob, the district's black market, because the legal system around her did not provide enough. She learned how to stretch food, how to hide skill, and how to keep fear from stopping her. Primrose Everdeen, her younger sister, grew up protected by that effort. Katniss became the wall between Prim and the full force of the district's hunger. That matters because it explains the choice she will later make. It also explains why District 12 becomes the place where the next great break in Panem begins. The district lived under rules that were both public and intimate. There were peacekeepers, there were fences, there was the annual reaping. There was the tesserae system, which allowed children to take extra grain and oil in exchange for putting their names into the reaping more times. That system mattered deeply in a poor district. It turned hunger into risk. The children who needed food, most were often the ones forced to increase their chances of being chosen. That's one of the clearest examples of how capital rule worked at ground level. Punishment was not only dramatic, it was administrative. It was built into how families survived. The district also carried the long shadow of Haymitch Abernathy. He was the only living victor from District 12. His survival should have made him a figure of honor. Instead, he had become a warning. He drank heavily. He lived in isolation. He was what the games had left behind. In a district with so little hope to begin with, even victory looked broken. Katniss's closest friend outside her family was Gale Hawthorne. He understood the same pressures she did. He knew hunger. He knew responsibility. He knew what it meant to grow up too fast in a place where childhood was always vulnerable to work, fear, and loss. By the time the 74th Hunger Games approached, District 12 had all the conditions that matter for the next turning point in Panem's history. It was poor. It was underfed. It was politically weak. It was used to being ignored. And yet inside that neglected district were exactly the things the capital understood least. People who knew how to survive, people who had little left to lose, and people who did not experience the nation as spectacle, but as pressure. That is the state of District 12 before Katniss Everdeen enters the national story. A mining district at the edge of the country. A place where hunger was ordinary, where the reaping was feared, and where the next major chapter in Panem's history was about to begin with one name called from a glass ball in the square. The 74th Hunger Games began with a name called in District 12. That name was Primrose Everdeen. She was only 12 years old. Her sister, Katniss Everdeen, immediately volunteered in her place. That moment is where the history changes. At first, it does not look like politics. It looks like instinct. A sister refusing to let another sister be taken. But in Panem, even something deeply personal can become public the moment it enters the square. And once it becomes public, the capital can no longer fully control what it means. The male tribute chosen that year was Peter Mellark. He was the baker's son. Katniss knew him already, though not as a friend. Years earlier, after her father died, and her family was close to starvation, Peter had burned bread on purpose and thrown it to her behind his family's bakery. That small act had stayed with her. It meant that before the games even began, there was already a history between them. Not a romance yet. Not a performance. Just a memory of kindness in a district where kindness could mean the difference between living and dying. From District 12, the two tributes were taken to the capital. There, the familiar machinery of the games took over. Stylists, training, public appearances, interviews, everything designed to transform frightened children into national entertainment. Katniss stood out almost immediately. Her stylist, Cinna, understood something important about the capital. If he wanted the audience to notice her, he needed an image they would remember. So for the opening ceremonies, he dressed her in a costume that made her appear covered in living fire. That is how she became known as the Girl on Fire. The image mattered. The capital always preferred tributes who could be turned into a story. Now, District 12 had one. Peter changed that story even further during his interview. In front of the audience, he confessed that he had loved Katniss for years. That confession stunned the capital. It also gave Haymitch Abernathy, their mentor, something he could use. He understood that sponsors were moved by emotion as much as skill. If the audience believed Katniss and Peter were a tragic pair rather than two ordinary tributes, they might stay alive longer. So before the arena even opened, the 74th Games already carried a tension that would define them from beginning to end. Something genuine beneath the surface, and something performed for survival above it. Then the arena began. The opening bloodbath at the cornucopia followed the usual pattern of the games. Weapons in the center. Tributes forced to choose between immediate risk and desperate retreat. The strongest children from the wealthier districts moved quickly. Those tributes, later known as the careers, had trained for this moment. They formed an alliance. They treated the games less like random terror and more like the competition they had been prepared to expect. Katniss did not have that kind of training. What she had was District 12. She knew how to move through woods. She knew how to find water. She knew what hunger felt like. She knew how to stay still, climb high, and conserve strength. Those skills kept her alive. The arena was trying to strip the tributes down to panic. Katniss entered it, already shaped by a life that had taught her survival. One of the most important turning points came when she allied with Rue from District 11. Rue was young, small, quick, and easy for the capital audience to underestimate. Katniss saw herself in her almost immediately. The two girls worked together. They trusted one another. They made plans. And in doing that, they broke the emotional logic of the games. The capital wanted children isolated, suspicious, and easy to turn into spectacle. Katniss and Rue created something human instead. That mattered, even before tragedy struck. When Rue was killed, the 74th Hunger Games changed in a way the Capitol could not fully contain. Katniss did not leave her body where it fell. She covered Rue with flowers. She stayed with her. She sang to her. Then she gave a farewell gesture to the cameras, a sign of respect and grief that could be understood far beyond the arena. That act was not violent. It was not loud, but it was one of the most powerful gestures in the history of the Games. It refused the Capitol's framing. It said that Rue was not simply a piece removed from the board. She was a child. She had been loved. She would be mourned. The districts saw that. District 11 especially saw it. And once they did, the Games were no longer only a spectacle. They had become a place where compassion itself could look like defiance. The Capitol tried to recover control. A rule change was announced. For the first time, two tributes from the same district could both be crowned victors if they were the last two alive. That changed everything for Katniss. It gave her a reason to search for Peter. She found him badly injured, hidden near the riverbank and camouflaged into the ground. From there, the story shifted again. Katniss nursed him. The cave scenes deepened the public love story. Some of it was strategy. Some of it became harder to separate from real feeling. That uncertainty became one of the defining features of their relationship. The Capitol believed it was controlling the narrative. Katniss and Peter were using that narrative to survive. As the arena narrowed, the deaths that remained became more personal and more strategic. Foxface died after eating nightlock berries, taken from Peter's collected plants. Thresh was killed. Cato became the final major threat. The Capitol altered the environment, driving the remaining tributes together for the ending it wanted. Then came the final reversal. Once only Katniss and Peter remained, the Capitol revoked the two-victor rule. Only one of them would be allowed to live after all. That was the moment when the 74th Hunger Games became historic. Until then, the Capitol had always controlled the ending. Katniss saw immediately what was happening. The rule had been used to build hope, shape the audience, and force the lover's narrative to its final test. Now, the Capitol wanted betrayal. Instead, Katniss reached for the nightlock berries. She offered Peter one. If the Capitol insisted on one victor, it would get none. That was the threat. Not open rebellion in military form. Something quieter and far more dangerous. A refusal to complete the ritual the way the Capitol demanded. The game makers stopped them in time. Katniss Everdeen and Peter Mellark were both declared winners of the 74th Hunger Games. That was the official result. The real result was much larger. A girl from District 12 had volunteered for her sister, honored a fallen tribute instead of helping erase her, and forced the Capitol to accept an ending it had not wanted. Panem had not fallen. The Games had not ended. But the country had seen something new. The Capitol could be pressured. Its control was not absolute. And once that truth entered public view, the 74th Hunger Games became more than a contest. They became the spark that would set the rest of Panem's history in motion. The 75th Hunger Games were announced as the third quarter Quell. Quarter Quells were never ordinary games. They were designed to remind the districts that the Capitol could deepen punishment whenever it chose. This time, The twist was devastating. The tributes would be chosen from the existing pool of victors. That meant the arena would not be filled with children who had never been there before. It would be filled with survivors. People who had already paid once. People who had already carried the cost of victory for years. For Katniss Everdeen, the meaning was immediate. She had barely returned from the 74th Games. She had barely begun to understand what her survival had done to Panem. Now, she was being sent back. So was Peter Mellark. That decision matters because it reveals exactly how Snow thought. He was not trying only to punish Katniss. He was trying to break the symbol she had become. If the Mockingjay had appeared in the arena, he would send it back into the arena and destroy it there. The reaping in District 12 confirmed that logic. Haymitch's name was drawn first among the male victors. Peter immediately volunteered in his place. That act deepened the emotional stakes at once. Katniss and Peter were no longer simply the pair from the last games. They were two people walking back into the same nightmare with full knowledge of what it would cost. The Capitol wanted that pain on camera. It wanted the districts to see that no one, not even a victor, could ever truly escape. The build-up to the quarter Quell exposed another change in Panem. The victors were not strangers to one another in the way ordinary tributes had been. They knew the system. They knew what it took. They also knew what the Capitol had done to them after their victories. Among them were people from different districts, different games, and different lives, but many carried the same wounds. Finnick Odair from District 4 was one of the most important. He was young, beautiful, famous, and widely desired in the Capitol. But behind that image was years of exploitation. Johanna Mason from District 7 had survived by pretending weakness and then turning violent when it mattered. Beatty and Wyrus from District 3 carried intelligence and technical skill into the arena. Mags, older than the others, represented another age of Panem almost entirely swallowed by the games. The quarter Quell gathered them all. That matters because the 75th Games are not only about Katniss and Peter. They are about what happens when the Capitol fills one arena with the living evidence of its own cruelty. The arena itself was designed as a clock. Each section of it unleashed a different danger at a different hour. Poison, fog, monkeys, blood, rain, lightning. The beauty and engineering of the arena showed how far the games had developed from the crude violence of the early years. They were now highly controlled, highly designed instruments of spectacle and death. Inside that arena, alliances formed quickly. Katniss and Peter joined with Finnick and Mags. Later, they linked up with Beatty and Wyrus. Those alliances mattered because once again, the games began slipping away from the Capitol's clean narrative. The victors were not behaving exactly as isolated enemies. Something else was moving beneath the surface. Katniss did not fully understand it yet. The audience did not fully understand it either, but a plan was already unfolding around her. Haymitch, Plutarch Heavensby, and others were working towards something larger than survival. Plutarch, the new head game maker, was not loyal to Snow in the way Snow believed. He was part of a conspiracy. The arena was not only a battleground, it was also becoming the site of an extraction. One of the clearest emotional centers of the quarter Quell comes through Peter. He understands earlier and more clearly than Katniss does that the rebellion needs her alive more than it needs him. Again and again, he tries to make that point. He wants Katniss to survive because he already sees what she has become to the districts. Not just a victor. Not just the girl on fire. A symbol people are beginning to build their hopes around. That is one of the reasons the Quell feels so different from the 74th Games. The arena is still deadly. But now the struggle inside it is tied directly to the future of the nation. The climax comes through Beatty's plan. He means to use the arena's force field and the lightning tree to attack the system itself. Katniss, in the final moment, understands enough to take the wire and fire an arrow into the force field. The arena breaks. That image matters as much as the berries did. The 74th Games showed the Capitol could be pushed. The 75th showed that its machinery could be broken. Katniss is lifted out of the arena. She survives. But Peeta is taken by the Capitol. So is Johanna, though she later survives captivity. The Quell does not end with a victor in the usual sense. It ends with the arena shattered and the war moving out into the open. When Katniss wakes, she learns the truth. District 13 was never truly gone. It survived underground. The rescue from the arena had been part of a rebellion already in motion. And she is now at its center, whether she wants to be or not. That is why the 75th Hunger Games matter so much. They are the point where the Capitol's favorite instrument finally turns against it completely. The games no longer contain the unrest. They no longer manage the story. The arena itself has been destroyed. And after that, Panem cannot return to the version of itself that existed before. The country is moving into open war. When Katniss woke after the destruction of the Quarter Quell arena, she learned the truth about District 13. It had not been destroyed at the end of the Dark Days. It had survived. For years, the Capitol had allowed the country to believe District 13 was gone. In reality, it had continued underground, hidden, armed, and separate from the public life of Panem. That revelation changed the history of the nation at once. For 75 years, the Capitol's version of the map had been false. One of the districts it claimed to have erased had endured beyond its reach. District 13 mattered long before Katniss arrived there. Before the Dark Days ended, it had been one of the original 13 districts. Its industry was graphite, and like the rest of Panem, it had once stood under Capitol rule. What made it different after the war was not that it escaped history. It was that it survived by leaving the visible history of Panem behind. District 13 withdrew underground and built itself around discipline, scarcity, and survival. By the time Katniss reached it, the district felt unlike any other part of the country. Its people lived by strict schedules. Its movement was controlled. Its routines were measured. Its culture had been shaped by life under threat for so long that personal freedom often came second to collective endurance. That mattered because District 13 wasn't simply a lost district restored. It was a different political force. The Capitol had become a center of spectacle, luxury, and theatrical control. District 13 had become severe, exact, and militarized. Where the Capitol displayed power, 13 contained it. Where the Capitol wrapped violence in ceremony, 13 wrapped survival in discipline. At the center of that district stood President Alma Coin. Coin is one of the most important figures in the final phase of Panem's history. She presents herself as practical, controlled, and committed to the rebellion. Under her leadership, District 13 had survived long enough to become the center of organized resistance. That made her powerful. It also made her dangerous. Quell did not believe in the capital's style of rule, but she believed deeply in structure, command, and using people for political ends. That is crucial to understanding what District 13 represents. It is not simply the good version of Panem. It is the anti-capital, but not necessarily the opposite of authoritarianism. Katniss enters this world physically alive, but emotionally shattered. District 12 has been firebombed. Most of its population is dead or scattered. She has survived the arena, but Peter has been captured by the capital. The shock of all of that hangs over her first days in 13. She is not brought into the district as an ordinary refugee. She is brought there as something much more useful, a symbol. That is what the rebels need from her. The Mockingjay. The capital had accidentally created that symbol through the 74th Hunger Games. District 13 now intends to weaponize it. Katniss does not accept the role immediately. That matters. She does not wake up eager to become the face of rebellion. She is suspicious, exhausted, angry, traumatized, and deeply aware that powerful people have been trying to use her ever since her first public appearance in the capital. Before she agrees, she sets conditions. The captured victors must receive immunity. Peter must be rescued if possible, and she must be allowed to kill Snow herself. Those demands matter because they show that even at this point, Katniss is still trying to hold on to some moral control over what is happening around her. Once she agrees, the war changes shape. District 13 does not only have soldiers and strategy now, it has the symbol the districts have already begun responding to. That symbol is turned into propose, short propaganda films meant to rally rebellion across Panem. The irony is important. The capital has spent decades using screens, ceremonies, and narratives to control the country. Now, District 13 begins fighting with images too. The difference is that Katniss's power on camera depends on truth. When she is forced, she fails. When she speaks out of genuine anger or grief, people respond. That tells you something important about the final rebellion. It is not built only on strategy. It is built on feeling, on memory, on the fact that the districts have lived too long under fear and now have a figure who makes resistance feel imaginable. So District 13's return changes Panem in several ways at once. It proves the capital's history is incomplete. It gives the rebellion a military center. It gives Katniss a political role she never asked for. And it introduces Alma Coin, whose vision for Panem is different from Snow's, but not as different as it first appears. That is the significance of District 13. It returns not as a lost home restored, but as the hidden force that had been waiting beneath the official history of Panem all along. And once it steps back into the open, the war against the capital can no longer remain scattered unrest. It becomes organized rebellion. Once District 13 stepped into the open, Panem moved from unrest into open war. The rebellion that followed is often called the Second Rebellion. Unlike the Dark Days, this conflict unfolds in a country that has already lived with the Hunger Games for generations. That matters. The capital is not simply fighting armed resistance. It is fighting decades of accumulated grief, humiliation, and fear. The districts begin to rise, some openly, some in stages, some with organized resistance, others through sabotage, defiance, or the refusal to keep accepting capital rule as permanent. District 8 becomes one of the first clear examples of this shift. Katniss visits a hospital there and sees wounded civilians, overworked medical staff, and the real human cost of the war. Then the capital bombs the hospital. That moment matters because it strips away any pretense that the capital is defending order. It is defending power. Katniss responds with one of the most effective propo moments of the rebellion. And from that point on, the Mockingjay is no longer just a symbol waiting to be used. She becomes the face of a war already spreading through the country. The rebellion gains strength because it is no longer only military. It is emotional. The districts know what the capital has taken from them. They know what the games have done. They know what happens to anyone who becomes inconvenient. Katniss gives those feelings a center. At the same time, the war becomes more personal. Peter is still in the capital. When he is finally rescued, he is not returned whole. The capital has hijacked him, using tracker-jacker venom and psychological conditioning to turn his memories against Katniss. That matters because it shows the kind of war Snow is now fighting. He is not trying only to win territory. He is trying to destroy trust, identity, and emotional stability. Peter becomes one more casualty of capital power even after leaving capital custody. The rebellion continues to spread. Districts fall out of capital control. Supply lines are attacked. Communication changes. The idea of Panem as one obedient nation begins breaking apart. And yet inside District 13, another pressure is growing. Quell is running the war with relentless discipline. She is effective. But the longer the conflict lasts, the clearer it becomes that her leadership is not built on freedom. It is built on command. Katniss begins to understand that she is not only caught between the capital and the districts. She is also caught between Snow and Quell, between two different visions of control. Eventually, the war moves toward the capital itself. That final push is not clean or heroic in a simple way. It is brutal. The capital turns its own streets into traps. Pods are placed through the city, turning neighborhoods into something like a final arena. That detail matters because the capital's logic never changes. Even at the end, it still turns controlled space into weaponized spectacle. Katniss enters the city as part of a star squad, alongside Gale, Finnick, Peter, and others. The mission is officially propaganda. In reality, it becomes a march through the last violent machinery of Snow's regime. Deaths follow quickly. Boggs is killed. Finnick dies in the capital sewers. The city itself becomes proof that the war has consumed everyone involved. No one reaches the end untouched. Then comes the bombing outside Snow's mansion. Children are sent forward as human shields. Medical workers rush in after the first explosions. Then a second wave of bombs kills them. Among the dead is Prim. That moment is one of the most important in the entire series. For Katniss, it changes the final meaning of the war. Snow is still the face of the capital. But by then, Katniss understands something else. Quell is capable of using the same logic of sacrifice, manipulation, and symbolic violence when it serves her political end. The bombing of the capital children breaks the last illusion that replacing Snow automatically means justice. When Snow is finally defeated, Katniss is publicly given the chance to execute him. Instead, she kills Quell. That act completes the real arc of the Second Rebellion. It does not only remove the old tyrant, it rejects the birth of a new one. Katniss understands in that final moment that Panem cannot survive if it simply trades one version of ruthless power for another. That is why the Second Rebellion matters so much. It is not only the war that destroys Snow's regime, it is the war that forces Panem to confront what kind of future it wants after him. The rebellion wins, but the victory is not clean. Too many people are dead, too much has been broken, and the country that survives the war must now face the hardest question of all. Not how to defeat the capital, but what to become once the capital is gone. Once District 13 stepped into the open, Panem moved from unrest into open war. The rebellion that followed is often called the Second Rebellion. Unlike the Dark Days, this conflict unfolds in a country that has already lived with the Hunger Games for generations. That matters. The capital is not simply fighting armed resistance, it is fighting decades of accumulated grief, humiliation, and fear. The districts begin to rise, some openly, some in stages, some with organized resistance, others through sabotage, defiance, or the refusal to keep accepting capital rule as permanent. District 8 becomes one of the first clear examples of this shift. Katniss visits a hospital there and sees wounded civilians, overworked medical staff, and the real human cost of the war. Then the capital bombs the hospital. That moment matters because it strips away any pretense that the capital is defending order. It is defending power. Katniss responds with one of the most effective propo moments of the rebellion, and from that point on, the Mockingjay is no longer just a symbol waiting to be used. She becomes the face of a war already spreading through the country. The rebellion gains strength because it is no longer only military, it is emotional. The districts know what the capital has taken from them. They know what the games have done. They know what happens to anyone who becomes inconvenient. Katniss gives those feelings a center. At the same time, the war becomes more personal. Peter is still in the capital. When he is finally rescued, he is not returned whole. The capital has hijacked him, using tracker-jacker venom and psychological conditioning to turn his memories against Katniss. That matters because it shows the kind of war Snow is now fighting. He is not trying only to win territory. He is trying to destroy trust, identity, and emotional stability. Peter becomes one more casualty of capital power even after leaving capital custody. The rebellion continues to spread. Districts fall out of capital control. Supply lines are attacked. Communication changes. The idea of Panem as one obedient nation begins breaking apart. And yet, inside District 13, another pressure is growing. Quell is running the war with relentless discipline. She is effective. But the longer the conflict lasts, the clearer it becomes that her leadership is not built on freedom. It is built on command. Katniss begins to understand that she is not only caught between the capital and the districts. She is also caught between Snow and Quell, between two different visions of control. Eventually, the war moves toward the capital itself. That final push is not clean or heroic in a simple way. It is brutal. The capital turns its own streets into traps. Pods are placed through the city, turning neighborhoods into something like a final arena. That detail matters because the capital's logic never changes. Even at the end, it still turns controlled space into weaponized spectacle. Katniss enters the city as part of a star squad, alongside Gale, Finnick, Peter, and others. The mission is officially propaganda. In reality, it becomes a march through the last violent machinery of Snow's regime. Deaths follow quickly. Boggs is killed. Finnick dies in the capital's sewers. The city itself becomes proof that the war has consumed everyone involved. No one reaches the end untouched. Then comes the bombing outside Snow's mansion. Children are sent forward as human shields. Medical workers rush in after the first explosions. Then a second wave of bombs kills them. Among the dead is Prim. That moment is one of the most important in the entire series. For Katniss, it changes the final meaning of the war. Snow is still the face of the capital. But by then, Katniss understands something else. Coin is capable of using the same logic of sacrifice, manipulation, and symbolic violence when it serves her political end. The bombing of the capital children breaks the last illusion that replacing Snow automatically means justice. When Snow is finally defeated, Katniss is publicly given the chance to execute him. Instead, she kills Coin. That act completes the real arc of the Second Rebellion. It does not only remove the old tyrant, it rejects the birth of a new one. Katniss understands in that final moment that Panem cannot survive if it simply trades one version of ruthless power for another. That is why the Second Rebellion matters so much. It is not only the war that destroys Snow's regime, it is the war that forces Panem to confront what kind of future it wants after him. The rebellion wins, but the victory is not clean. Too many people are dead. Too much has been broken. And the country that survives the war must now face the hardest question of all. Not how to defeat the capital, but what to become once the capital is gone. By the time the war reached its end, Coriolanus Snow had already lost the country. What remained to him was the capital itself. And even that was collapsing. The districts had risen. District 13 had returned. The rebellion had spread from symbol to army, from anger to open force. The system Snow had spent his life preserving was now breaking in public. That matters, because Snow had always ruled through control, through image, through ritual, through the certainty that the capital could decide how every story in Panem ended. Now, for the first time in decades, he was no longer controlling the ending. That loss of control is what defines the final stage of his rule. Snow does not fall in one clean moment. He is weakened in stages. First, the districts stop behaving as though capital victory is inevitable. Then, the war reaches the capital. Then even the city, that had once represented luxury and order, becomes a site of fear, barricades, traps, and civilian panic. The rebellion is no longer at the edges of Panem. It is at the center. That shift matters because the capital had always depended on distance. Distance from hunger, distance from labor, distance from punishment, distance from the reality it imposed on everyone else. Once the war enters the capital itself, that distance begins to disappear. Its people become vulnerable. Its streets become dangerous. Its children become afraid. For the first time, the center of Panem experiences what it had long forced outward onto the districts. Snow remains the face of the capital through all of this. He speaks. He appears. He tries to preserve the image of command. But the shape of power has already changed around him. He is no longer the unquestioned ruler of a nation at peace. He is the head of a government under siege. And the deeper the siege goes, the clearer another truth becomes. Snow's authority has always depended on making other people pay for the stability of his world. Now that world is collapsing anyway. The moment outside his mansion brings that to its final point. Capital children are gathered at the front. Medical workers rush toward them after the first explosion. Then a second wave of bombs kills both the children and the rescuers. Among the dead is Prim Everdeen. That moment matters because it destroys the last simple version of the war. Snow is still the tyrant. He is still responsible for decades of cruelty. But in those final hours, Katniss understands that the future can still be poisoned by the same logic that built Panem in the first place. The sacrifice of the powerless for political ends. When Snow is brought out for execution, he's no longer the distant, untouchable president of earlier years. He's frail, bleeding, laughing at the chaos because he understands, even then, what Katniss is beginning to see. The old order is ending, but the danger of another one has not disappeared with it. That is why Snow's fall is not only the removal of one ruler, it is the collapse of a whole political order built on fear, spectacle, and controlled suffering. The Hunger Games, the capital's luxury, the yearly ritual of humiliation, the belief that power could remain permanent if violence was packaged carefully enough. All of that falls with him. Snow's death matters historically because it marks the end of capital rule as Panem had known it for generations. The man who had overseen the system, refined the games, and ruled the country through terror is gone. But his fall does not arrive as a triumphant, clean ending. Too much has happened, too many people are dead, too many children have been used, too many survivors have been broken in ways that cannot be repaired by one execution. That is what gives Snow's fall its weight. It is necessary. It is overdue. But it is not enough by itself. Removing the tyrant does not automatically heal the nation he ruled. It only creates the possibility of something different. By the time Snow falls, Panem has already passed the point where it can return to the old order. The capital has lost. The rebellion has won. And the country now stands in the dangerous space that follows every great collapse. The moment after power breaks, when the future is still undecided, and when what comes next matters as much as what has just ended. After the war, Panem did not become simple. The capital had fallen. Snow was gone. The rebellion had won. But victory did not erase what the country had been. It did not erase the dead. It did not erase the Hunger Games. It did not erase the decades of fear, hunger, propaganda, and punishment that had shaped nearly every life in the nation. That is the first truth of Panem after the war. The old order was over. Its damage remained. For the first time in generations, the country had a chance to become something other than the capital state. That chance mattered. So did the question hanging over it. What kind of nation could possibly be built after a history like this? One answer came quickly. The Hunger Games would end. That mattered more than any single law. For so long, the games had been the clearest symbol of what Panem was. A nation willing to turn children into punishment and call it order. Ending them meant more than stopping one institution. It meant breaking with the logic that had defined capital rule. Children would no longer be used to reenact the past each year. The old ritual was over. A new government also began to take shape. Commander Paler of District 8 became president. That mattered because she represented something the old Panem had never truly allowed. Leadership coming out of the districts rather than being imposed above them. Her rise did not solve everything, but it signaled a real change in the structure of the country. Power no longer belonged automatically to the capital. That alone marked the beginning of a different political world. Still, Panem after the war was not a story of instant healing. Too much had been broken for that. Districts had been bombed. Families had been erased. Victors carried years of trauma. Children who survived the games had become adults shaped by violence before they were old enough to understand it. Even those who lived to see the end of Snow's rule had no easy way to step out from under what Panem had made of them. Katniss is the clearest example. She survives the war. She survives the capital. She survives Coin. But survival is not the same thing as restoration. By the end, she is exhausted, grieving, and changed in ways that cannot be reversed. She returns to what is left of District 12. Peter returns too, though altered by what the capital did to him. Haymitch remains. Greasy Say remains. A small life starts again in the ruins of a much larger one. That matters because Panem's history does not end with a throne changing hands. It ends in the quieter question of whether people who have lived through that kind of world can still make something human afterward. Katniss and Peter eventually build a life together. It is not immediate, it is not simple, and it is not written as a fairy tale. It comes slowly, with memory still present, with loss still present, with the past never fully gone. That is one of the strongest final truths in the history of Panem. The country survives, but survival does not erase what happened there. The old system leaves scars on the people who lived inside it. The nation that comes after Snow must therefore be judged not only by whether it removes the capital's cruelty, but by whether it refuses to rebuild the world on the same foundations. That is why Katniss's final choice matters so much. By killing Coin instead of Snow, she rejects more than one leader. She rejects the idea that Panem can be remade through another version of the same ruthless logic. She refuses to let the future begin with another political class claiming the right to use children, fear, and spectacle for supposedly necessary ends. That act helps define what post-war Panem must not become. So what is Panem after the war? It is a country in recovery, a country in grief, a country no longer ruled by the capital, but not magically free of the damage the capital caused. It is a place trying, for the first time in a very long time, to imagine itself without annual punishment, without enforced spectacle, without the old center holding every other region in place, through fear. That is not a clean transformation, but it is a real one. By the end of the series, Panem has not become perfect. It has become possible. And after everything that came before, that possibility is one of the most important changes in its history. By the end of the war, Panem had lost the order that had defined it for generations. The capital had fallen. The games were over. The old system had been broken. Only then was it possible to step back and see Panem clearly for what it had been. Panem was not just a nation, it was a structure, a country built after collapse, held together by central power and organized around unequal dependence. At the center stood the capital. Around it were the districts. Each district had a function. Each one supplied something the nation needed: food, coal, power, technology, transportation, luxury goods, textiles, livestock, lumber, agriculture, industry. The system was efficient in one sense. It kept the country running, but it was never neutral. The districts did not exist as equal parts of a shared nation. They existed inside an arrangement that served the center first. That is the simplest way to understand what Panem was. The capital ruled. The districts sustained it. That reality shaped everything else. It shaped wealth. It shaped hunger. It shaped who was protected and who was exposed. It shaped who was allowed comfort and who was expected to carry burden. And because that structure lasted for so long, it came to feel permanent. Children were born into it. Families lived and died inside it. Victors were broken by it. Entire districts learned to think of themselves through the roles the nation had assigned them. That is one reason Panem was so powerful. It was not only enforced from above, it was lived from below. Its rules entered the calendar. Its demands entered the household. Its punishments entered the body. A district child could feel the country in the reaping bowl. A mining family could feel it in the risk of the shaft. A hungry household could feel it in tesserae. A victor could feel it in the fact that survival never really meant escape. The capital's greatest success was not merely commanding the country, it was turning that command into everyday life. That is also why the Hunger Games mattered so much. They were not separate from Panem's structure. They were the purest expression of it. The capital took the children of the districts, staged their suffering, and made the nation watch. Everything Panem believed about power was inside that ritual. The center had the right to take. The outer regions had to give. Fear could be organized. Memory could be weaponized. And cruelty could be made to look like order if it returned often enough. That was Panem at its most honest. Not in its speeches, not in its ceremonies, in the games. But the country was larger than the games alone. Panem was also a map of controlled labor. Every district existed within a wider design. Some were closer to the capital and treated differently. Some were poorer and more exposed. Some had strategic value. Some had symbolic value. Some could be ignored until they became inconvenient. District 12, for example, was poor enough to be dismissed right up until it produced the girl who changed the nation. District 13 was declared destroyed, then returned as the hidden fact that shattered the capital's version of history. That too reveals what Panem was. A country built on control, and therefore always vulnerable to truth. Because once the truth came back into view, once the districts could see one another more clearly, once the capital's power no longer seemed absolute, the whole structure began to break. So when we ask what Panem was, the answer is not just that it was cruel. It was organized cruelty. It was a country built after catastrophe that answered insecurity with hierarchy. It concentrated political power in one place. It divided labor across the rest of the land. It maintained obedience through force, spectacle, hunger, and fear. And it survived for as long as it did, because it taught people to treat that arrangement as the natural shape of the world. That is what made Panem so dangerous. Its injustice was not hidden. It was normalized. Its inequalities were not occasional failures. They were built into the design. Its violence was not random. It was structured, repeated, expected. By the time the war ended, Panem had already spent decades teaching generation after generation the same lesson. That power belonged at the center, that sacrifice belonged at the edges, and that the cost of challenging that order would be paid publicly. The rebellion broke that lesson, but it did not erase the fact that Panem had once been built on it. That is why this part of the history matters. Before moving district by district, before looking more closely at the parts that made up the whole, it helps to name the nation clearly. Panem was a centralized state born from collapse. It ran on district labor. It protected capital power. It used memory as punishment. And for most of its existence, it held together by making inequality feel inevitable. That was Panem. And to understand the country fully, you have to understand not just that it fell, but how it was built in the first place. To understand Panem fully, you have to understand the capital and the districts together. They were never separate stories. They were one system. The capital stood at the center of political power. The districts stood around it, each tied to labor, production, and the work that kept the nation alive. That was the basic design of Panem for most of its history. The capital ruled. The districts supplied it. Everything else grew out of that arrangement. The capital was more than a capital city. It was the place where wealth, authority, luxury, and decision-making were concentrated. It consumed what the districts produced. It shaped the laws of the nation. It controlled the military. It controlled the games. And because it stood above the daily labor of survival, it was able to appear polished, theatrical, and distant from the harsher realities that defined life in much of the rest of Panem. That distance mattered. It allowed capital citizens to live inside comfort, while the districts carried the burden of making that comfort possible. District 1 stood close to the capital in status and in image. It was known for luxury goods, jewelry, and decorative items. Its work was tied to beauty, display, and wealth rather than basic survival. That gave District 1 a distinct place in Panem. It was one of the districts most closely tied to the capital's tastes. Its tributes often entered the games as careers. Children trained to compete and raised in a culture that treated victory differently from the poorer districts. District 1 shows that not all districts suffered in the same way. Some were favoured more than others. But favour was never freedom. District 2 was one of the most important districts in the country. It was associated with stonework, masonry, and military strength. Peacekeepers often came from District 2. That gave a special relationship to the capital. It was not only a producer, it was part of the machinery that enforced order across Panem. For that reason, District 2 often seemed more loyal to the capital than the others, at least for much of Panem's history. District 3 was tied to technology. Its people built, repaired, and understood the systems that helped modern Panem function. Electronics, engineering, and technical skill gave District 3 a quieter kind of importance. It was not as visible as the luxury of District 1 or the force of District 2, but it mattered deeply to the operation of the country. That becomes especially important later, when rebellion depends on sabotage, weapons, and systems knowledge. District 4 was the fishing district. Its life was shaped by the sea. Its people knew boats, nets, tides, and the labour of bringing food in from the coast. Like Districts 1 and 2, it often produced career tributes. That tells you something about how Panem's inequality worked even among the districts themselves. District 4 was still subordinate to the capital, but it was stronger and more resourced than places like District 11 or District 12. District 5 was responsible for power. Electricity flowed out of it. That made it one of the most quietly essential districts in Panem. A country can survive without luxury. It cannot function long without energy. District 5 sat close to one of the main veins of national life. Its work was less visible than grain fields or coal mines, but just as necessary. District 6 was transportation. It dealt with the movement of goods and people. Roads, rail, vehicles, and the routes that connected one part of Panem to another all ran through its function. That role made District 6 important to the shape of the nation itself. Panem was not only a hierarchy, it was also a network. The capital depended on the districts, but it also depended on the ability to move what they produced. District 7 was lumber, forests, timber, and physically demanding outdoor labor shaped its identity. Its work feels rougher and more direct than that of some of the industrial districts. It was tied closely to terrain, weather, and physical endurance. District 8 was textiles. Factories, fabric, uniforms, and production lines defined the district. Its labor was repetitive, enclosed, and industrial. District 8 often feels like one of the clearest examples of Panem turning entire populations into production units. It later becomes one of the first major centers of open rebellion, which makes sense in a district where labor and oppression were so constant and visible. District 9 was grain. Wide fields, harvest, and food production at scale shaped its place in the nation. It is easy to overlook compared to the capital or District 12, but that would be a mistake. Grain is basic, fundamental. A country can only pretend to power if it has food. District 9 helped make that possible. District 10 was livestock. Its life was tied to raising animals, fencing land, feeding, slaughter, and the physical work that came with all of it. Like District 9, it belonged to the necessary lower structure of the nation. Not glamorous, not politically central, but essential. District 11 was agriculture on a larger and more visible scale. Fields, orchards, crops, and the long labor of drawing food from the land defined it. It was one of the biggest and most heavily burdened districts in Panem. District 11 also makes the injustice of the system especially clear. It produced nourishment, yet its own people remained poor, heavily watched, and harshly controlled. Rue and Thresh both came from District 11, and the district's emotional importance grows because it helps show how grief, memory, and resistance begin moving across district lines. District 12 was coal. Small, poor, remote, and politically weak, it sat at the edge of the nation in more ways than one. Its houses were worn down. Its mines were dangerous. Its people lived close to hunger. Children took tesserae to survive. Families could be destroyed by a single explosion underground. And yet, from District 12 came Lucy Gray Baird, Haymitch Abernathy, Katniss Everdeen, and Peter Mellark. That matters because Panem's weakest-looking district helped produce the people who would eventually unravel the whole system. District 13 was different. Originally, it was one of the 13 districts of Panem. Its industry was graphite. After the Dark Days, the official story was that it had been destroyed, but it survived underground and outside the public map of the nation. When it returned openly during the Second Rebellion, it did not return as a normal district. It returned as a disciplined, militarized society built around secrecy, survival, and command. That made it the hidden truth beneath the capital's version of history. Taken together, the districts form the body of Panem. The capital was the head. That was the arrangement. Each part of the country had a role. Each role fed the center. Each district was necessary, but necessity did not bring equality. Some districts were richer. Some had more status. Some were trained to think of the games differently. Some were punished more harshly. Some were remote. Some were strategically crucial. but all of them existed inside the same larger order. That is why the district system matters so much. It was not just geography, it was ideology made physical. Panem divided people by labor, by opportunity, by access to comfort, and by distance from authority. The capital's greatest political success was turning that arrangement into normal life. The districts did not simply produce resources, they produced the nation itself. And because every district had a different role, it was harder for them to see themselves as one people at first. That fragmentation helped the capital survive. It kept suffering local. It kept identity regional. It made solidarity harder. That is one reason the moments of connection matter so much later on. Katniss honoring Rue. District 11 responding. Victors from different districts recognizing one another. The rebellion succeeding only when Panem stops seeing itself as separate labor zones and begins seeing itself as one broken nation. So when you look at the capital and the districts together, you see the real design of Panem. A country built after collapse. A central city raised above the rest. Outer regions organized by function. Labor flowing inward. Power flowing outward. Some districts favored. Others neglected. All of them necessary. None of them free. That was the system. That was the nation. And that is what had to be broken before Panem could become anything else at all. And that is the history of Panem. It began in the ruins of North America. It hardened into a nation built around the capital and the districts. It survived one rebellion, then answered that rebellion with the Hunger Games. It raised Coriolanus Snow, refined cruelty into ritual, and taught generations to live under fear so steadily that fear itself began to feel ordinary. Then, after decades of control, the system began to break. A girl volunteered for her sister. A victor honored the dead instead of helping erase them. An arena was broken. A lost district returned. A second rebellion spread across the country. And in the end, the capital fell. What makes Panem so lasting as a story is not only its violence. It is the way that violence was organized, the way power was arranged, the way an entire nation was taught to accept that some lives would be protected while others would be used. That is the logic of Panem for most of its existence. A shining center, a burdened outer country, a system that looked permanent until, slowly and then all at once, it no longer did. By the end, Panem is changed. The Hunger Games are gone. Snow is gone. The old order is gone. What remains is a country trying to live after everything it has done to itself. A country that has survived, but not cleanly. A country with memory still inside it. Grief still inside it. Hope there too, but quieter, harder one, and more careful than before. Maybe that is the final truth of Panem. It was never only a place. It was a warning about what happens after collapse, about what happens when fear is organized into government, about what happens when spectacle replaces justice and when control is treated as more important than human life. And yet, it is also a story about what survives inside systems like that. Memory survives. Love survives. Defiance survives. Even in Panem, especially in Panem, those things survive long enough to matter. Now the country can begin to grow quiet again. The capital is no longer the center it once was. The districts are no longer bound in the same way. The arenas are empty. The old ceremonies are over. What remains are roads, fields, mines, woods, shorelines, towns, and the people who must now decide what kind of nation they want to build from what is left behind. For now, though, it is enough to let the history settle. To leave Panem where it finally belongs, not inside the capital's version of itself, but in the full shape of what it was, what it became, and what it cost. And with that, the story can rest.